Okay, so let's get the show started. As you can see here, um, the topic of the class is obviously about should yeshiva students or yeshiva bochrim, as I'm going to be referring to them, should they serve in the Israeli army? And this is a really, really pressing question. It's especially poignant now that we're facing an existential threat to the country. And I was just listening to the CBC on my way over to show this, the world at 6. And everything seems to be convulsing. Everything seems to be going topsy-turvy with massive protests all over the Arab world. And it's looking like there is a possibility, it's above zero, that whatever is going to happen, whatever's happening in Israel is going to expand, is going to it's going to become perhaps something bigger, much more perhaps catastrophic, which is definitely not the direction that we would like to see things go. But that is, perhaps the reality that we face. And so there's a very, very prominent question: should the draft in Israel apply to yeshiva bochrim? Throughout the state of Israel's existence, it's granted military exemptions to full-time yeshiva students. And these exemptions and decisions that were made by some yeshiva students that they serve in the army or not serve in the army has been really a matter of discussion and debate ever since Israel was founded. So we're going to take a look right now, and here we go. We're going to take a look at perhaps the 6 arguments why the draft or why yeshiva bochrim should not serve in the army. These are the 6 reasons that are argued. We're going to go through them. We're going to be discussing them. But here you have them. Here you have a thumbnail sketch of all the points that one could perhaps make to argue that bochrim should not serve in the military. And here you have number 1: a man of God ought not to fight. There is this prevailing myth in the world in which we live that says that if you are a man of peace, if you are a man of God, then you're not a man of violence, you're not a man of controversy. You just sort of sit in your corner and you study, and you don't engage in anything that could be considered controversial, or could be considered in any way problematic. The very first argument that one could make is that perhaps fighting in the military is just not something that a man of God should do. And then you have the counterpoint over here, and it seems to be giving me some trouble. Here you go. We have biblical templates. We can definitely see within the Torah that men of God have been potent and powerful leaders and fought in wars. Reason number 2 as to why yeshiva bochrim should perhaps not serve in the military: they should emulate the tribe of Levi. We're going to be discussing this. We're going to go through the sources, but there is a line of reasoning, a rationale that says that the tribe of Levi did not fight in any of the wars that the Jewish people took part in. The counterpoint that we're going to show is that, well, the example of Levi is not exactly certain. It's possible that he did, possibly that the tribe did, it's possible that they didn't. And as such, there is there's a bit of a discussion to this. Point number 3 that talks about why perhaps somebody should not fight in the military, that yeshiva bochrim should not be drafted. There's a lack of clarity as to what's considered to be a milchemes mitzvah. There's an idea that certain wars that we fight are commandments, they're obligatory, things that we do definitely have to fight. The reason why we should perhaps argue that a yeshiva bochrim should not fight, well, is because there's no mitzvah for them to fight. So maybe that should be a reason for them to stay at home. Well, that's the reason why we would perhaps argue and say that they should be drafted as well. Yeah, there are definitely cases where fighting the war would be considered to be a mitzvah, and maybe at the very least they should be drafted for those types of wars, those sorts of fights. All right, now we have Now we have source number 4 as to why it is that perhaps the yeshiva bochrim should not be drafted. Well, we have an argument here that says that if someone is engaged in the performance of a mitzvah, they're absolved of all other mitzvah obligations. This is something we're going to be discussing. We're going to go through this. But yes, this is actually a rule. If you are doing a mitzvah, you do not have to do other mitzvahs. If you're, for example, on your way to redeem slaves and captives, you do not have to sit in the sukkah. On sukkahs, you're allowed to eat on the road. If you're engaged in a mitzvah, there's no obligation to perform other mitzvahs. Maybe we can say that the reason reason why a yeshiva baruch should not be fighting in the military is because they're engaging in a mitzvah, therefore they're not obligated to do anything else. The counterpoint is that, well, that's true. We do have a rule that says you're absolved from all of their mitzvos. That doesn't necessarily apply to Torah study. While it's true that we say certain mitzvos have a certain exonerating effect, Torah study does not. What's the purpose of studying Torah? So that you can keep the Torah. It's counterintuitive, but if you're going to say I don't have to keep the Torah because I'm studying the Torah, then what's the purpose of studying Torah to begin with? So that's the reason. That's the counterpoint to that argument. All right, now the fifth explanation, the fifth reason as to why a yeshiva baruch should not be drafted. Well, the righteous require no protection because they are protected in and of themselves through divine providence. Well, that doesn't necessarily apply to fighting wars, as we're going to discuss. It's not so obvious. It's not so simple. That line of rationale that we're going to discuss, it's not so simple. All right. Now, number 6, the study of Torah aids the fight. There is an overarching concept that the study of Torah is in and of itself an integral good. It does good things to the universe. It repairs all the things that are wrong with the world. There is some inherent power in the study of Torah itself. So the argument could be made, we need people to be studying Torah in the yeshivos while the soldiers are fighting, because that's what provides the agency, the ability of the Jewish soldiers or the Israeli army to fight. What guarantees their success is the fact that there are people at home studying Torah. There is such a line of reasoning. The counterpoint to that is, well, at most, that would mean that you can't coerce someone. Would that mean you would turn someone away if they volunteered? Like something like a Hester yeshiva would perhaps be the answer to that claim. The final reason over here, you'll notice that the reasons to say no, the reasons why yeshiva baruch should not be drafted, has only 6 reasons why no. Here you have 7 reasons why yes. And this is what I think, and this is what we're going to come to at the very, very end, probably the most compelling and most important reason as to why it is that yeshiva baruch should perhaps fight in wars, join the military, enroll in a Hesder yeshiva, is this one biblical imperative that we see from here. It comes to us from, I think it's in Vayikra, it's in Bamidbar. We'll take a look in a minute. It says, Lo sa'amod adam reyecha ani Hashem. Don't stand idly by the blood of your fellow. Don't let your fellow Jews die as a consequence of your inaction. That is probably the most compelling reason that someone should be drafted or somebody should fight in the military. But now that we've sort of clarified, we now have the thumbnail sketch of all the points and counterpoints. Let us now address these point by point. People often ask the question, so we're going to discuss the first reason why they should not be drafted. Should spiritual people serve in an army? People often ask, how can someone who's engrossed or somebody who's completely engaged in spiritual matters serve in the army? You know, we were just talking before about people who play hockey versus people who don't play hockey. Generally speaking, or at least people who enroll in the police academy. Who enrolls in the police academy? It's generally not the math and science geeks. It's the big burly jocks. So perhaps the argument could be made that who is it? Who are the types of people who end up studying Torah? Well, they're the emaciated, pasty-faced people who tend not to spend all that much time in the sun. Those are the sorts of people you would say represent, what we think of as a spiritual folk. Generally, that's what we think of. Who is a tzaddik? Somebody who doesn't make any problems, someone who doesn't get into any arguments or fights, who lives an ascetic life in the corner of their house and sits and meditates, prays, and studies all day. The answer to that question, the counterpoint is, well, we actually do find many biblical templates. Our ancestors, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Yehoshua, and especially David HaMelech, these were all people who reached spiritual heights, yet they excelled at waging war. The Gemara, in fact, describes the phenomenon, at least with regards to David HaMelech, the King David. So here we have the Gemara. It's in Moen Katan. You have it on the screen in front of you if you're at home. Here you have it projected on the screen. Here it says, we're just going to read it. It's quoting a pasuk from Tehillim. It says, and he was the same Adino the Eznite. This alludes to the fact that when David would sit and occupy himself with Torah study, he would make himself soft. He would ma'andein himself as a worm, the Talmud says. He made himself like a worm, meaning he was so soft and pliable. But when he would go out to war, he would make himself as hard as a tree. So you see here that Moshe, I'm sorry, no, not Moshe right here, David HaMelech, King David, was multifaceted. And that's not necessarily a contradiction. Human beings can be complicated and we can have many aspects of ourselves. You can be a deeply spiritual, deeply sensitive individual, yet at the same time excel as a military commander and fighter. We're going to take a look over here. This guy over here is Rabbi Yehuda Amital. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Amital is a fantastically important individual because he was the creator of the Hesder Yeshiva movement, the movement that incorporates Torah study along with military service. In fact, he was one of the founding rabbis of Yeshivas Har Etzion. He was also a member of the Israeli cabinet. He wrote extensively about this. He cites David HaMelech, this Gemara that we just read, as a model paradigm for Hesder Yeshiva students. They grapple with the subtlety of great Talmudic commentaries such as the Ktsos, the Nesivos HaMishpat, and Reb Chaim Brisker, and all these really, really important people if you've ever studied Gemara. While on the other hand, they serve with great distinction in the Israeli army. And indeed, at least in Rav Amital's writings, it's why he widely reports that religiously observant soldiers comprise a significant portion of the junior officers in certain Israeli army units. It doesn't necessarily mean that all these people are in Hesder Yeshivos, but you definitely do see that there is a running theme that people who are Torah observant can be effective, successful, and powerful warriors who can fight a battle when called upon to do so. And we also have many others. Take a look at the source over here. This is from the Ramban, Nachmanides, the 13th century Spanish authority. He was here writing about why it was that the Pelishtim under Avimelech signed a peace treaty with Yitzchak. Why did he, when he was kicking Yitzchak out of his country, why was it necessary for him to sign a peace treaty on his way out? And this is what the Ramban writes. It's possible that Avraham was very great and mighty in his power, having in his household 300 men who drew swords, also many Confederates. And he also was valiant, whose heart was the heart of a lion. And he chased, as we know, after the 4 powerful kings and subdued them with just 318 individuals. So when the Plishtim, when the Philistines, when they saw that Avraham had great success, which was clearly from Hashem, the king of the Plishtim was fearful of him, lest he conquer his kingdom. And since this would be then easier than fighting against the 4 powerful kings, he therefore grabbed Yitzchak on his way out as he was kicking him out and said, but we're going to sign a peace treaty before you go to ensure that your descendants do not come and conquer my descendants. And the truth is, besides for these notable individuals, take a look at the source over here. This is when Moshe Rabbeinu was appointing officers to fight against Amalek. On their way out from Egypt, the Jewish people were attacked by the Amalekim, and he informed Yehoshua, you're going to gather a group of people around you who are going to fight with you. Choose men. And we're going to see over here, what does it mean, men? It doesn't mean giborim, it means mighty men, true, but also v'yirei chet. Not only do they have to be mighty, but they also have to be mentioned. They have to be menshes. So anoshim over here doesn't only mean be men of valor and men of strength. It also means men who are real men, who maintain Torah values and are fearful of sin. And the hope is, as he says over here, that the schus will aid them, their merits that they were able to, from their observance of Torah, will aid them in their fight against Amalek. We also see that very similar criteria was employed by Moshe when it came to fighting against Midian. The Radak and the Malbim, these are commentators to Nach, they write and say for Shoftim that Devorah, the prophetess, gave special praise to the people of Machir and Zavulun, precisely because they sent their religious leaders to fight alongside their regular troops in battle. So all these sources clearly indicate that there's no fundamental problem between with having spiritual leaders serving in an army. But that's true in the biblical context. The advisability of their service in the Israeli army today can still be left up to debate, and we're going to go further down this rabbit hole. Now, what was the second point that we said was perhaps the reason why a yeshiva bachur should not be drafted? Well, because we want to emulate the tribe of Levi. What exactly does that mean? This is here what the Rambam writes. This is Maimonides, and he writes this at the end of the laws of Shemitah and Yovel. He writes the following: Why did the tribe of Levi not receive portion in the inheritance of Eretz Yisrael and the spoils of war like their brethren? Well, Maimonides writes, because they were set aside to serve God and minister unto him and to instruct people at large in his just paths and righteous judgments. As the Torah says, they, referring to the Leviim, will teach your judgments to Yaakov and your Torah to Yisrael. Therefore, they were set apart from the ways of the world. They do not wage war like the remainder of the Jewish people. I've highlighted this, or I've emboldened it rather, because this is what many people point to. Nor do they receive an inheritance, nor do they acquire for themselves through their physical power. Instead, they are God's legion, as it says. God has blessed his legion, and he provides for them, as it says, I am your portion, your inheritance. Talking about the tribe of Levi being given everything that they need. And the Rambam continues, and this is in the next section, the next halacha. Again, the 13th chapter of Shemitah and Yovel. This is now halacha number 13. But he said, expands this, not only the tribe of Levi, but any one of the inhabitants of the world whose spirit generously moves him, and he understands with his wisdom to set himself aside and stand before God to serve him and minister to him and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him, therefore God will remove from his neck the yoke of his many reckonings which people seek. He is sanctified as the Holy of Holies. God will be his portion, his heritage forever, and will provide what is sufficient for him in this world, like he provides for the priests and the Leviim. Thus, David declared, God is the lot of my portion. You are my cup. You support my lot. Blessed be the merciful one who provides assistance. So this is the Rambam speaking. So the Rambam here is essentially saying the tribe of Levi did not go to war, did not go to battle. And not only that, but anyone could become a honorary member of the tribe of Levi, being the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people. And the Rambam, therefore, perhaps presents an argument that says Yeshiva Bachurim should not be drafted. And again, this passage is very often cited. But this application, however, contains some very serious legal problems, because this is a Rambam coming at the very end of one of his works. The Rambam had a practice, and in fact, many rabbis do this when they write. The final paragraphs are devoted to Agada, Agadita. It's a reference to sort of moral exhortation, but are not necessarily legally binding statements. It's possible that here the Rambam is not speaking as a halachic authority. Rather, he's giving a little bit of musar, saying that people should devote themselves to Torah study. And what raises this question even further is that who is the individual that the non-Levi that he quotes as a proof to this supposition? It's King David, and we've just clarified that King David was a military leader. So the halachic imperative that this Rambam presents is questionable. And we also have to ask another point. Is the Rambam correct when he says that the tribe of Levi did not fight? It's actually debatable. There is no source in the Talmud that says that the tribe of Levi did not fight in any battles. And the only source that we do have is a midrash called the Sifri. And this Sifri is problematic because there are two variants in the text. One says that they're excluded from having to fight, and the other one says that the other version of the text says that they are obligated to fight. So the whole question, the whole thing that this is predicated on is flimsy to begin with. And here I've reproduced for you on the top over here. It says over here, it's talking about how 1,000 people from every tribe were chosen to fight against Midian. And there's a superfluous wording over here. Matam l'chol matos Yisrael tishlechu litzavo. Why do we have this superfluous wording over here from all the tribes of Israel? Well, you have in one version lahavi as shifto shel Levi, which comes to exclude the tribe of Levi, meaning that all the tribes sent 1,000 people except the Leviim. And then you have the other version, which is actually the version that Rashi has, which is that to include them, to say that they were obligated to fight. So again, there's no rabbinic source. There's no source from Chazal that says that Levi was exonerated or absolved from having to fight the battles that the Jewish people had to fight. There's no source for this. When the Rambam says it, maybe it's authoritative, maybe it isn't. It's not quite certain, and who knows. whether or not it's an actual halacha, maybe it is not an actual halacha, and the ultimate source that it's based on is perhaps problematic to begin with. All right. The truth is, though, that if you were to take a look throughout much of Nach, you will find that not only did the tribe of Levi frequently fight in war and battle, but Kohanim did as well. And in fact, the Radak points out that we know that the Kohanim fought in battle because who was David's minister of war? Actually, who was one of his high officers who became the minister of war under Shlomo HaMelech? Benayahu ben Yehoyada. He was a Kohen. So we see that Kohanim do fight in battle. Not only that, but if you were to take a look at the Gemara in Kedushin, as well as the Rambam, Maimonides, they go through all the halachos that pertain to people who fight who also happen to be Kohanim. So we see that there is a great deal of source, there's a great deal that indicates that there's nothing that excludes the tribe of Levi from fighting. And so we don't have a ton to say about this. There is a svara ahin and a svara aher, as they say. There's a svara this way, there's a rationale this way, and a rationale this way. At least when it comes to arguing that Torah scholars should emulate the tribe of Levi, it's flimsy, it's on shaky ground. On one hand, we have sources that say one thing, and on the other hand, we have sources that say the other. What's a source that says that they should not fight? Well, because whenever a census was performed in the desert, they would always include people who would go to battle. Who was always excluded from the census? Levi, right, exactly. So the implication is from some places in the Torah that they did not fight. So again, saying that Torah scholars should emulate the tribe of Levi is flimsy because we have reasons to say yes and reasons to say no. Yes, they did fight. No, they did not fight. Yes, they were drafted. No, they were not drafted. So that cannot be used as a justification or a proof one way or the other. Okay, now rationale number 3, Milchemes Mitzvah. There are certain wars that are considered to be a mitzvah, they're obligatory, and there are other wars which are not necessarily considered mitzvahs. We classify these sorts of battles into two ways. We have discretionary wars, milchamos rishus. What are these? Some examples of these are wars fought to enlarge the borders of Israel. Another one is a war fought to bring glory to the king. So, for example, when David HaMelech, after he established his monarchy, he went off on a conquering spree. He conquered Syria, he conquered Edom, he conquered Moab. He did this to expand the borders of the country. He did this to glorify God and to glorify his own name. That's considered to be an elective or a discretionary war. There's no Torah obligation that created an imperative that he fight those wars. Those are considered discretionary. There are, however, other wars that are considered to be obligatory Torah commandments that we must fight. Examples are the war against Amalek, the war against the Canaanite nations that ultimately precipitated the establishment of the original Jewish state. We also have here the Rambam writing wars that save Jewish people from enemies who attack them are also considered to be milchamos mitzvah. They're considered to be mitzvah wars that have a biblical imperative to fight. So it follows from this Rambam then that all the wars that the state of Israel ever engaged in could be classified as a milchemes mitzvah or milchamos shel mitzvah. For just about every single one of them were fought in order to save the Jewish people from enemies who attacked them. And let's take this further. Now we have this concept, this idea. Let's go now to the Mishnah and in Maseches Sota. It says, this is again talking about the obligation to perform a mitzvah, obligation to fight these wars. We have the Gemara in Sota talking about all the people who have military exemptions. And now the Mishnah clarifies, when were these exemptions given? When do we say that a person who was just recently married, a person who just recently planted a vineyard, a person who just recently built a new home, all those military exemptions that are mentioned in the Torah, when are they said? They're only spoken with regards to discretionary wars, elective wars. All those exemptions All those exemptions are not in application, however, when it comes to a milchemes mitzvah. When it comes to a milchemes mitzvah, everybody goes to fight, even the groom, even the kala, even the bride. And where do I have this? Okay, you know what? I did not include this. I thought I did. I did not include this in the presentation. There is the Karen Ora, who's a Torah commentator, who actually does clarify, and this is considered to be fairly authoritative in its source. He says even Torah scholars have to go and fight these wars of milchemes mitzvah. So therefore, the argument could therefore possibly be made that based on this, that we see that everyone's obligated to fight. There are no military exemptions when it comes to a war to fight to protect Jews. There are no exemptions, and that even is inclusive of Torah scholars. So that would mean then that there should be the draft that applies to Yeshiva Baruchim. Yeshiva Baruchim should fight in the military. However, we get into a bit of a complication, because then we can, at this point, that we have to address the 900-pound gorilla in the room. Is every single method of waging war considered to be a milchemes mitzvah? What do I mean? This over here is the Lechem Mishnah. It's a commentary to the Rambam. It's a commentary to Maimonides. And we said that Maimonides holds that wars that are fought to protect Jews is considered to be an obligatory mitzvah commandments type war, which would then perhaps obligate a Torah scholar to fight. Take a look here. This is what he says. Our master, the Rambam, decided that the halacha follows that of the rabbis, and that there are only two categories of war, obligatory or discretionary wars. A war waged by the house of David to expand its territory or to limit a foreign nation's ability to attack is considered discretionary. That's a very important line there. The Lechem Mishnah here is saying that when you're fighting a war, the first shot has to be fired by the enemy. A preemptive war would not be considered to be a mitzvah obligatory war. So the argument then could be made, well, then we're going to create a whole strata of different kinds of soldiers who fight in different kinds of wars. According to this, if you were to draft Yeshiva Baruchim, and they were going to argue, we do not have to fight wars that are not considered mitzvah obligations. You have no right to draft us for any non-mitzvah obligatory war. Well, then they can also claim perhaps that a preemptive attack would not be considered to be a mitzvah obligatory battle, and as such, they should not be called upon to fight. Now, this Lechem Mishnah is saying that that's not considered to be a milchemes mitzvah. Now, we do have people who disagree. For example, the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, who is one of the most important halachic rabbis of the late 19th century, very, very early 20th century. He passed away in 1909, 1908 or so. He is, for Lithuanian Jewry, considered to be the premier halachic authority. In the generations before the Mishnah Berurah sort of gained acceptance, he was considered to be the primary source of sort of non-Hasidic Ashkenazi practice and halachic application. And within there's a rabbinic elite that still values what he has to say more so than the Mishnah Berurah for one reason or another. We're not going to get into that now, but he actually wrote a Shulchan Aruch of his own that Rabbi Yosef Cairo never wrote, about what will happen in the future about the establishment of a Jewish state. He's talking in the days of Mashiach. He's not talking about a secular Zionist state, but he does say, however, that fighting a preemptive battle to protect Jews is considered to be a mitzvah. But he still argues that perhaps Torah scholars should maybe not be drafted to fight such a battle, because generally preemptive wars do not require the same numbers of troops as you do to fight a defensive one. You'll always need people for the home guard. And so therefore he argues, yeah, it might be a mitzvah, but perhaps Torah scholars should not be drafted to fight that specifically. So anyways, what have we done anyway here? We've clarified the third reason, we've spoken about the third reason. Should Yeshiva Baruchim be drafted? Could we say that they should be drafted because there's a mitzvah obligation for them to fight these battles? That includes even them. We've also shown that it's not so obvious that you can apply that rubric to Yeshiva Baruchim, because there are many different parameters, and there's much more that could be said about this, but it's not so obvious. So again, what are we doing? We're going point by point and counterpoint. The arguments, yes, they should be drafted. The arguments, no, they should not be drafted. Next reason to argue they should be drafted. This is a very, very frequently cited explanation, which is osek b'hamitzvah patur min hamitzvah. Someone who is engaged in mitzvah A is not obligated to perform mitzvah B. This is a mission over here. It comes to us from Masechah Sukkah, and it's the case that I mentioned earlier. You have someone who is out to free captives. He's on his way over with a whole bunch of money to pay some ransom so that Jewish captives would be set free. That person who's on the road does not have to sit in the sukkah. He can eat his meal as he goes because he's engaged in the mitzvah, therefore he's not obligated to perform a mitzvah. The Gemara says, how do we know this? Where do we derive this from? Well, we derive this from the Shema, where it says, you shall sit in your house and study the Torah, not study the Torah, but I guess it's sitting in the house and say the Shema. When you're doing another mitzvah, there's no obligation to say the Shema. And this actually does come up if you're engaged, for example, the Halacha, the Shulchan Aruch talks about this, when you're engaged in a levaya, when you're burying the dead, you don't have to stop to say the Shema, even if the time to say the Shema will pass because you're engaged in the mitzvah. So this is something that we definitely do say has halachic application. And we essentially say that perhaps the argument could be made that Torah study should exonerate or absolve one from having to fight in the army. Take a look at this clause over here. This is what the Ritva says. The Ritva was Rabbi Yom Tov ben Avraham. He was a Spanish authority. I believe he's 13th century, might be a bit later, might be 14th century, I'm not sure. But he gives the explanation. He's one of these classical Talmudic commentators. He says, the mitzvah one engages makes all others of lesser importance. There then become now no longer obligations. Thus, it's forbidden to cease the mitzvah that you're engaging in order to perform another. So he takes this a step further. Not only are you absolved, he even says you're forbidden from doing it, which is those are fighting words. This gentleman over here is Rabbi Zalman Baruch Melamed. He is a fascinating guy, right? He's still living. He is a student of Rabbi Tzvi Yitzchak Kook. He was who was the son of the famous Rav Kook. He was a scion of Merkaz Harav. He is one of the he fought in Yeshivas Eitz Chaim. He's also was the founder of Arutz Sheva. So if you've been listening to the news from him, I guess you could say you're welcome. And this actually just goes to show just how far-reaching this argument is. He's very, very much in the Mizrahi religious Zionist camp, but he actually argues that the draft should not apply to Torah scholars based on the aforementioned reasons. He says that the Israeli army can function without the service of every man in the country. Based on that, he says the obligation to fight, the osek b'hamitzvah, to fight a war, you're engaging in Torah study. He says it's true that perhaps they should be exonerated. I didn't say this, I forgot to mention this. The counterpoint to that argument is, well, that doesn't necessarily apply to Torah study. Again, as we said before, Torah study, there's no purpose to Torah study if you're not going to keep the Torah. So as such, the counterpoint is that, well, you can't use Torah study as a way of getting out of fighting in the army. Rabbi Zalman Melamed here, he says, Rabbi Zalman Baruch Melamed actually argues, and he takes this counterpoint to the counterpoint and says, you can only argue that Torah scholars have to study Torah, have to stop studying Torah to perform another mitzvah only if there's no one else to do it. But the military can function without all these yeshiva guys. And in fact, by virtue of the fact that the government gives out these exemptions, it kind of indicates that, yeah, they can kind of get by. It may be politically unpalatable, it might be distasteful to some people, but the implication is by the fact that the country does give these exemptions that the military can operate without all these yeshiva bachrim. And there's also in 1986, there was actually a study that perhaps this has been borne out in some more recent research. The sources that I had were from the 1980s, because that's when this topic became really, really interesting in terms of what people were writing about it. There was an argument made at the time that says that, if you actually go to the top brass of the Israeli military, they don't want these yeshiva bachurim. Intensely distrustful of authority unless you meet an incredibly high metric of ideological purity. And we know what kind of conscripts, what kind of soldiers conscripts make, not very good ones. And in a situation where where every soldier on the front counts, you cannot have a breakdown in discipline. The military high brass in Israel, at least according to some of these 1980s studies, did not want the Yeshiva Bachram drafted, precisely for that reason. Rav Moshe Feinstein also goes as far as to say that since exemptions are given, it does indicate that the military can function without them. Therefore, he says Yeshiva Bachram have no obligation to enroll, and if their heart takes them, they should enroll in a yeshiva and avoid the draft thereby. So what have we done here? We've spoken about this other reason, the rationale that perhaps says, well, if you're engaged in a mitzvah, you're therefore exonerated of performing other mitzvahs. Therefore, if you're studying Torah, you shouldn't have to fight, even if it's a milchama, even if it's a battle, even if it's a war that can be classified as a mitzvah. Perhaps they should not be obligated. The counterpoint to that is, well, that doesn't apply to Torah study. If you're studying Torah, you still have to stop studying Torah to keep the Torah. To which the counterpoint is, well, that's only true if no one else will be able to perform the mitzvah. If the mitzvah will be done without you, then yes, Torah, engaging in Torah study does absolve you of having to fight. Point, counterpoint, counterpoint to the counterpoint. Again, we don't have any clear answers over here. You have arguments in one direction, arguments in the next direction. All right, who do we have next? Okay. I think this is the fifth reason as to why they should not fight in the military, they should not be drafted, is based on the writings of Rabbi Jacob-Mikveh Tukachinsky. Now, Rabbi Jacob-Mikveh Tukachinsky definitely is the first Haredi rabbi that I'm actually quoting. He was from the Eidah Haredis. He was a contemporary of Rav Kook. He wrote the canonical book of the laws of mourning, the Gesher HaChaim, which is the rabbinic source text for anything that has to do with bereavements, burials. He's an incredibly interesting and incredibly far-reaching Talmud Chacham, but he actually quotes from a Gemara. This is the Gemara. No, this is something else. This is something else. Okay, I guess I did not include it. All right. There's a Gemara in Baba Basra that says that all the people of a town can be taxed to build a wall around the town. A protective wall is a necessity. It's a requirement. In the Middle Ages, it was absolutely necessary because every marauding band of bandits would come through and take everything that you owned. Cities needed walls. There's a halacha that says all the citizens of the city have to contribute to paying the tax to build the wall. The Gemara in Baba Basra over says that excludes Talmudic scholars, because Talmudic scholars do not require protection. God protects them. So as a result, he argues that they should not be drafted into the military because they don't need the protection because they have their own protection. What does that mean for everyone else? I don't know, but it definitely means, at least according to him, that they should not be obligated to fight. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Shaviv, who one of the let's go back. Here, Rabbi Yehuda Shaviv, he's one of the Roshei HaYeshiva of Yeshivas Har Etzion, also somebody who's very, very prominent in the Hester Yeshiva world. He actually quotes the Chassam Sofer, who says that Gemara is only talking about the obligation to pay the taxes. It doesn't mean you don't have to fight in the battles of the war, right? All it means is that you don't have to pay the tax. It doesn't mean you don't have to actually fight. And as such, according to Rabbi Yehuda Shaviv, the argument could be that while it's true they don't have to pay the taxes, it doesn't mean they don't have to fight in the battles themselves. They're not absolved of that obligation, especially if you say that fighting the battles in Israel are considered to be wars that are considered mitzvos. They would be obligated to fight according to the Chassam Sofer, and that would be the counterpoint to that argument. There's also, I noticed Marina, she started tittering when I mentioned that, Torah scholars do not require protection. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who we'll talk about a little bit more shortly, actually wrote, and he wrote about this extensively. He said the spiritual qualities that somebody has to have in order to be assured that they have spiritual protection from God is so extreme that he doesn't think that just about anyone who's alive today would qualify, with some very, very rare exceptions. And as such, that whole argument is perhaps moot and should not be considered. So this was the final halachic argument anyways. And again, we've covered many different arguments here. Some arguments that would say that they should not be drafted, and the counterpoint to those that would argue, no, they should be drafted. The sources, the rationale, the reasons that have been thus cited can be disputed. There are a number of agadic statements, which are not legal statements that found in the Talmud, that perhaps provide a moral imperative. The Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the Rav of I'm trying to remember the hospital. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. I think it was Sharet Tzedek, yeah. I think it's Sharet Tzedek. He was the Rav of Sharet Tzedek in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. He's considered to be an exceptionally important halachic authority, especially when it comes to medical halacha. He wrote extensively about end of life issues. And his stuff is infinitely interesting. But he actually quotes an agadic statement that comes to the Gemara in Maseches Makos. Omer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, "What is the meaning of that which is written? Our feet were standing in your gates, O Jerusalem. What caused our feet to withstand our enemies in war? It is the gates of Jerusalem, where they engaged in Torah study. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he interprets the standing or in gates doesn't necessarily mean actually physically being in the gates, but rather with your gates or because of your gates, the place of Torah study and the place of the Sanhedrin where judgments were given. It's considered to be a center of Jewish study and Jewish law. What preserved our ability to fight was the fact that there was Torah study going on in Jerusalem. So he argues that this text would seem to indicate that it is necessary in order to guarantee that soldiers are successful on the field of war through the Torah study that the yeshiva students provide back at home. But perhaps it's not so conclusive. It's possible that what we're talking about over here are not necessarily people who are not, that you don't draft these people. Rather, we're talking about the elderly or the people who are unwell or all those emaciated, pasty-faced people who never leave their house, who can't pick up a barbell and as such would fail their medical examination. Maybe those people would be absolved of one's obligation to study Torah or start fighting the battle in order to study Torah. But there's no conclusive proof over here that would indicate that we should not be drafting these people to fight. We also have another obligation over here, for another source. Omer Rabbi Avohu, Omer Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Avohu said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, why was it that Abraham was punished? He was told that his children would inherit the land of Israel, but only after they were enslaved in Egypt for, according to rabbinic tradition, for 210 years. Why is it that he was punished in this way? Why couldn't he just get the heirs of Israel because they lived in Israel? Why did they have to leave, be enslaved, and then come back? Well, Rabbi Avohu said, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, because he drafted Torah scholars. As it says, he led forth his trained men born in his house. Trained can also mean those educated men. The Hebrew word chanichav can be understood perhaps in a more modern sense to refer to those who are Torah educated. So here we seem to have an imperative that says that you shouldn't draft these people because you could be punished as a consequence. Similarly, we see that King Asa, according to the Gemara and Sota, was stricken with illness at the end of his life because likewise he was drafting Torah scholars to fight in his military. What would the counterpoint to this be? Well, Rabbi Avohu, who's speaking now in the name of Rabbi Elazar, is not the only opinion of the Gemara. You, in fact, have 9 other opinions in the Gemara. Perhaps you can argue that those 9 other people overrule and disagree with Rabbi Avohu, and they would say, no, there's no proof that there is any imperative not to, or prohibition against drafting yeshiva bachrim. At the very least, perhaps what we can say comes from many of these sources is that you shouldn't draft them. You shouldn't coerce yeshiva students, but does that mean that they have no imperative of their own, no moral responsibility? I think we can say that there perhaps is a moral responsibility. And I would even argue and I'm not the one who's arguing this, it's actually Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who we'll talk about in a moment, who actually says that the moral imperative that we're going to discuss does create an obligation, and perhaps we can say that there is a mitzvah involved, there is an obligation, and no, yeshiva bachurim should not be exempted from the draft. This is Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein is essentially the intellectual founder of Yeshivas Har Etzion. He was one of the first settlers in Gush. He started off his life at Yeshivas Rabbi Chaim Berlin as a student of Rav Hutner, but ended up in Yeshiva University, where he in fact became a primary student of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, eventually becoming Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik's son-in-law. And these names are important in the world of modern Orthodoxy, because the theology of modern Orthodoxy, really what modern Orthodoxy as it exists here in North America, was really started by Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. And this is basically the person who is his primary disciple, who was the torchbearer after he passes away. And perhaps what he has to say should have the most importance for us here tonight. He actually bases it on this pasuk in Vayikra, Lo sa'amod al dam reyecha ani Hashem. This comes to us in Vayikra, where it essentially says, don't stand idly by the blood of your fellow. You have to act. If you see people are suffering, people are dying, you have not only a moral imperative, but you have a Torah obligation, and that Torah obligation can perhaps even be enforced by the state. And I think this is probably the most conclusive, and I think this is the final word. In fact, it's going to be my final word. We've discussed many different arguments back and forth. Should they be drafted? Should they not be drafted? Is it because Torah scholars shouldn't be fighting battle? Is it because Torah scholars don't have to protect themselves? Is it because Torah scholars are engaged in a mitzvah of one sort or another? We've discussed all these reasons, and we've shown that there's an argument that can be made in either direction. But I think no argument could be made against this one point that essentially says, the Torah says, if somebody's going to die, if you don't raise your finger, you got to raise your finger. And this is God speaking, not just me, and it's not just from Aaron Lichtenstein. This isn't the Talmud, this isn't Gemara, and this isn't a group of Haredi or Zionist rabbis who are arguing and fighting, discussing this point. This is the Kadosh Baruch Hu saying this. And the argument can be made also that someone does bear a responsibility, a obligation, and can in fact be penalized and punished for not fulfilling this imperative. And I think this is the most important thing that I think everyone should walk away with. Even if you're a Torah scholar, if you're going to engage yourself in Torah study, you should join a Hesder Yeshiva so that you can marry these two. You can fight and you can also study Torah. And the imperative to do so comes from this voice, the voice that is sort of articulated through Aaron Lichtenstein, who comes to the conclusion based on this verse, based on this pasuk, Lo samud adam reyecha ani Hashem. Don't stand idly by the blood of your fellow. And in conclusion, anyways, and this is not directly connected to anything we've said thus far, I'd like to dedicate all of this Torah study to all the people who are suffering, all the people who were killed in the calamity over the past few weeks, under the attack that was perpetrated by Hamas. The Torah study that we have performed tonight should be Ilui Nishma Sam. It should be an aliyah for all of their neshamos. And the Torah that we study tonight should be considered a merit. It should be considered a zechus that acts to protect every fighting man, woman in Israel who have all been centered around Gaza, who have all been congregated around Gaza, as well as anyone living in the land of Israel. No one should suffer, no one should die. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bring in a happy resolution to all of these problems soon, hastily, and with great immediacy. And perhaps the Torah that we're studying tonight will act to affect that and make it all the more precipitous. And with that, I'm open to questions, comments, and or rebuttals and all.